Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 20th meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I remind everyone present, please, to turn off or at least turn to silent all mobile phones and other electrical devices. We have apologies this morning from Ruther Grant, MSP. Item 1 on the agenda, can I ask the committee to agree to take items 5 and 6 in private? Great, thank you very much. Item 2 on the agenda, the committee is continuing our scrutiny of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. At stage 1, we have 2 panels. Our first panel has joined us this morning. I'd like to welcome Susan Love, Policy Manager for Scotland, the Federation of Small Business, Andy Miles, Parliamentary Officer, Scottish Environment Link, David Watt, Executive Director, Institute of Directors, Scotland, and Gareth Williams, Head of Policy, the Scottish Council for Development and Industry. Good morning, all. Now, I think we'll just go straight into questions. We're slightly constrained by time this morning. I would remind members, if they would, to keep their questions, as ever, concise and to the point, and if we can have concise responses, that would be very helpful in getting through the quite broad range of issues we want to try and cover in the time available this morning. And I would ask members if they would direct their questions at a particular individual. That would be very helpful. And if any of you on the panel would like to respond to a question directed to somebody else, if you just catch my eye, I will bring you in as best I can. You'll all be familiar with the bill. I think there's a number of issues of interest to the members here. The broad issue of why we need better consistency of regulation, how that's going to work in practice in relation to local variation, the question of how opt-outs might work, this question of a duty to promote sustainable economic growth, questions of the code of practice, questions around the planning issue and the proposal to reduce planning fees in the event of poor performance by planning authorities, and finally questions around mobile food businesses and their licensing. So I think we'll try and cover these questions if we can, as time allows. Can I maybe just start off by asking, in relation to the bill which is designed to improve regulatory performance, why do you think there is a need for greater consistency across Scotland? Or in other words, can you highlight an example of where you think there's a particular problem that needs to be addressed? And that's a general question. Maybe Susan Love, will start with you from the Federation of Small Business.
Thank you. The committee may be aware that the FSB has done quite a lot of work regarding consistency of regulation. However, I should say that most of our work has related to local regulation and local regulatory frameworks in Scotland. And I appreciate that the bill does apply to regulation in the round. Last year, we particularly published a paper looking at various aspects of local regulation in Scotland and how we felt it could work better. And one of the aspects that we highlighted was the degree of inconsistency in how certain regulations are applied, particularly by local authorities. So we've set that out in a paper, and I think we also included some particular case studies for committee in our written evidence, setting out how these types of inconsistencies manifest themselves. And these are largely around processes, procedures, conditions that could be simpler for businesses to understand what is required of them if they were applied more consistently across the country. And the particular instances that we've highlighted relate to issues which are not really to do with local circumstance. They're largely to do with custom and practice. And therefore we think that consistency could be achieved, and the bill would be a way of achieving that.
Okay, thank you. As you mentioned, local circumstance, can you give me an example of an area where you think there are local circumstances that would justify local standards as opposed to national ones?
Sure. I mean, what we tried to set out in our evidence is that I don't think we are suggesting it should be consistency to the extreme, consistency above all other principles of better regulation. Better regulation is about achieving a balance of the different principles to achieve effective regulation. So it's quite understandable that in order to achieve a balance between consistent regulation and proportionate regulation, there would be times at which you would need different approaches. And I think we'd highlighted that liquor licensing in particular is one where it would be quite understandable that you couldn't have a national approach on, for example, opening hours, because of course you will need to have different opening hours, different types of conditions around that, depending on the situation, depending on the geography and the place. The issues that we've highlighted are more around procedural matters.
That's very helpful. Andy Miles?
I would very much agree with a considerable amount that Susan's had to say, and would add that the consistency is not just about the consistency over local issues. The consistency should be consistency at national level as well. Environment Link is very pleased to support the measures in the bill which we've discussed with the agencies and others as they've been developed, to see that there is a consistent playing field for business across environmental regulation. It's important we understand for business that businesses have a level playing field, and we're assured that the provisions in the bill will mean that those who are creating the inconsistency of cutting corners will in fact come down on like a ton of bricks by the agencies concerned. And we will be allowing the businesses that are playing by the rules to carry on and promote the economy and all other aspects of their work. So we're very much in favour of seeing that kind of consistency and better regulation. Where we have the problem, as you'll have seen from our written evidence, is that we also think there should be consistency within the law, and we think that there is a danger of serious inconsistency and confusion over the duty of sustainable economic growth.
We're going to come on to that,
yes,
in a short time. David Watt?
Yes, I would agree really with colleagues so far as well. I think the key issues for us bluntly are about the implementation as well of legislation in the sense of speed and promptness of response to inquiries, and that applies across a number of areas. Obviously planning is talked about at length, and there was some examples of that later on as well. But that's also true, I think, about consistency and about response from agencies. And I'll give you you asked for a specific example, very specific example of a builder who can't develop a building site with 50 houses planned because the Scottish Water and SEPA can't decide what's the best form of drainage. Yeah, that sort of delay, bluntly, it doesn't help anybody. And I think delay means costs. Even where planning permission and everything is agreed to go ahead, that fairly sizable technical delay causes some problems, and that's not unknown, and that's a very real case, but it happens on more than one occasion, sort of thing. I think in general terms as well, I'll come back to sustainable economic growth, but we do put that as a high priority. But the consistency, businesses knowing where exactly they stand, I think there is an area where this could be helped by the legislation, although we're never that kind of legislation as a whole. But I think if we can empower ministers to make sure that the bodies sing from the same hymn sheet and act more promptly, then I think that's going to be a step in the right direction.
Okay. Gareth Williams?
As an organisation which represents not only businesses but regulators as well, we recognise the benefits of greater consistency for them both. We welcome the changes that have been made since the initial consultation. We did have some concerns about the imposition of national standards in an inflexible way. And we think what's been proposed has taken into account some of those concerns. As regards specific examples, I think the FSB's submission highlights a number of those. In seeking evidence from our members, it does seem as though a lot of the concerns affect more at the SME scale of business. And we tend to represent larger businesses, although not exclusively. And the concern that they most frequently raise, and David's already highlighted it, is around the planning system.
come on to that in due course. Okay, thank you. That was just a softball to warm you all up. So now get into the hard stuff. I'll bring in Chick Brody.
Good morning. Can I just challenge this notion of consistency? We've all agreed that there needs to be consistency, and yet we've talked about local variations. Where do you actually draw the line between the two? Went to all of them. Well, that was Susan.
Thank you. I think it's inconceivable that you would be able to do this without a collaborative approach. I think that particularly the examples we've raised where we think there could be national standards are issues where we would envisage the regulators, the regulated, the government, local government sitting down together and agreeing what the balance would be.
That hasn't happened, has it?
I don't think we have tried that.
So you believe there's anarchy out there in terms of how regulations are interpreted by different local authorities or different bodies?
No, I think the presumption at the moment and the way that the system that we have in Scotland of how local regulations are implemented has a presumption in favour of a principle being passed by Scottish Parliament and then all details more or less being left up to the individual local authority to determine. And there are some limited examples of where there has been discussion with the Scottish Government and local authorities to attempt to agree more consistency in how that primary legislation is implemented. But by and large, as we've set out in the paper, in most examples, it is left up to each local authority. And we think that if there was a process that compelled everyone to sit down and agree, which parts of this implementation process can we all agree will do the same way, and which parts do we all agree should be left up to local discretion? We think that's a sensible way forward.
Mr. Miles?
Where consistency is concerned, I would actually speak up for the system as it stands. I think that there is a relatively good level of consistency within our planning system and within our regulatory systems. It could be improved, and if you improve it, you'll still get a developer who will come and tell you that there is inconsistency, because inconsistency depends rather where you start from. A developer will tell you there's...
Just on that, if I may, sorry to interrupt. Are you telling me that you believe that the current system, if we take, and I don't want to dwell on this too long, but wind farms, for example, that there's consistency in approach even by neighbouring councils?
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting that relatively there is a relative consistency. But what I was going on to say was this. If you've got a renewable energy developer who's developing an in-stream hydro generation product, if there happens to be freshwater pearl mussels in the river that they're developing, that's not consistent with the river in the next glen, which doesn't have the freshwater pearl mussels. And so you're likely to have a businessman or businesswoman who is aggrieved that there's an inconsistency in the system. A great deal of what we hear in terms of inconsistency, I'm suggesting to you, is in fact caused by the facts of the matter and where they are. And I'm not going to join with colleagues on the panel this morning in simply saying that we have the most terribly inconsistent system. There are glitches, but however much this committee improves that matter, I think you will still have people coming to you and telling you about inconsistencies. It is a movable feast.
Surely the whole point of having meaningful regulation is to minimise what currently is a confused system leading to inconsistencies, whether it's the pearl mussels, yet again, come here, that we discussed yesterday. So in the chamber, the way I see you're trying to have it two ways. Say that it works, or almost works today, although there are some inconsistencies. So don't regulate. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm definitely in favour of regulation, particularly in favour of environmental regulation to protect the freshwater pearl mussel. It isn't consistently present in every stream in Scotland, though.
Okay. Mr. Watt?
I think I can, while well understand the reasons for local democracy and input to various choices and decisions that might be seen as suitable for one area of Scotland or another, and that's obviously acceptable and understandable. And best to illustrate the point by quoting, and again a very real example of a significant hotel developing company who comes up and one day goes into two major cities, which will remain nameless in this for the purpose of this debate, but in actual fact are not that far apart. And one walks into the plan, the offer on the table basically is they're looking to develop a 200-bedroom hotel. One meeting starts with, delighted to have you here. We're here to see how we can do this as quickly and as suitably as possible for you and for us. Okay. The other meeting starts with, oh, I don't know if we can do that. It might take 18 months before we can even talk about it. That's not consistent. That's not good for Scotland. It's not good for either of these cities either. And it does put people off. And that is a fact. And in private, I could give individuals the name and detail, but I'm not prepared to do it publicly, obviously, but it's a factual case. That's as a consistency that is required. And I suppose the other thing that appears to me, and I've got to say, truthfully, I don't have the figures, that appears in terms of planning, for example, there are more call-ins back to ministers. That might suggest the point you've just made. There's a bit less consistency for developers, knowing what they're going to face when they try and develop in certain areas of Scotland.
I suspect I know the answer to the next question I'm going to ask you, Mr. Watt, but it would be interesting to have a reaction from some of the other members of the panel. In the whole panoply of things, the whole spectrum of what we're trying to achieve, where do you put economic growth versus economic development, or sustainable growth against sustainable development in any planning decision?
I've got to say, truthfully, in life and in business, I would say I'm visionary. So we're looking at that, actually, that we absolutely must drive forward. And I think, I've got to say, I find some of the debate that's going on a bit bluntly quite arcane, actually. We need to have a clear vision that Scotland needs a sustainable economic growth. We can talk over the semantics of sustainable. I'm quite happy to do that if you wish to do it, but I'm not sure it gets us a great deal of places. The fundamental thing that we take the view is that my members, 1,700 of them in various businesses all across Scotland, large and small, 24/7 are trying to grow a business which brings in money into this country, into the local communities, into their employees. Yeah. And my view is that this building, this parliament, the politicians, the government agencies should work with them to do that. Okay. And that's the number one thing, that for our employees currently, for their children, for the benefit of the country. Bluntly, if politicians want to decide how to spend money once we earn it, that's the way the system works. But we need to get the money earned first, okay? And business needs to do that. Now, I'm not suggesting business does it in an unconstrained way, and there needs to be some regulation because some people will bend the rules, to put it mildly. And I understand that. I'm not supporting that. But the fundamental thing is, if our members don't have the opportunity to make the money, then we don't have it to spend. So we're all going in the same direction, and that's the bit that annoys me about this debate around about sustainable economic growth. Surely everybody in this building, in this country, must believe in that. And yes, we can fine-tune the wording of it, but let's focus on that. And we all benefit from it. Is that how you share out the benefits of that is for you guys to decide, not me. But it's me to help my members to work with you to create the wealth that you decide how we allocate it to members of our society. It's not very complicated. That's where we're trying to go.
I have some sympathy with that view. Mr. Williams.
On the issue of national standards, I think what we're seeking would be a change in the emphasis, and the presumption would be towards national standards, but where there was evidence which could be put forward in favour of local flexibility, then that local flexibility should be available. On the point, the subsequent point about sustainable economic growth, obviously our remit is around promotion of sustainable economic growth, and we therefore welcome the proposed duty. I think it does make sense, given that that is the overarching purpose the government has for public services. I agree with much of what David has said. I'd simply add that we over the last 10, 15 years, we in Scotland, as in with many economies in the Western world, have had historically very low rates of economic growth. We're still in that position today. And a number of long-term spending commitments and entitlements have been based on growing economies. So if we want to be able to afford those, we need the economic growth. And that's why, or one of the reasons why we believe that, that there has to be that emphasis across a range of government functions.
So, do you believe that we need to have sustainable economic growth? And in the event that anyone wants a definition, I have several here. We need that before we can underpin things like sustainable development. Is that what we're saying?
I think sustainable development. I think the interpretation that can be placed upon that by some perhaps emphasises the individual sustainability of a given project. I think when we talk about sustainable economic growth, we can look at the totality of a range of developments and how they are each contributing towards longer term targets. So I think that including sustainable economic growth is important in that it will change the emphasis not just at the top level within regulators, but throughout regulators. It will give a signal that this is a priority for government, and I think it could change the relationships that regulators have then with businesses.
Do you agree with that, Mr. Miles?
I'm not quite sure that I understood what was being said to agree with, but I can't give you...
Well, let me try and help you. Where is the priority in terms of the need for regulation of economic growth versus sustainable economic growth versus sustainable development? And I think...
I see sustainable economic growth as a subset of sustainable development. I don't think that they're different things.
So we disagree?
We disagree.
Right. Thank you.
Mr. Miles.
Yes, Dennis Robinson.
This is really for Mr. Miles. Is there a conflict with regard to environmental issues and sustainable economic growth, or are you content within the bill that the reform that is being proposed actually meets your objectives?
When it comes down to it, fundamentally, members of Environment Link will follow scientific evidence and a fundamental ecological principle that any species exploits its environment. Every species exploits its environment. If the species exploits its environment sustainably, it will thrive and survive. But if it exploits its environment unsustainably, then it's on the way to the exit. It's on the way to extinction. And that applies to the human species just as much as to any other species. And so our belief in sustainable development follows through from discussions that have happened at a global level, EU, UK, Scots law, a long and distinguished scientific background which says that our development, economic, social or environmental, should be sustainable, that we should not be driving ourselves over the cliff of climate change, for example, or any of the other environmental disasters which we might press ourselves towards by the blind pursuit of economic growth. Now, I'm not saying that the environment movement is opposed to economic growth, because it is not, but it is very definitely opposed to unsustainable economic growth. And distinctions need to be made, and regulators need to be present to make sure that alongside the sustainable economic growth, we have no, or we fight against unsustainable economic growth, and that balance is maintained with the social and environmental developments which we need if we're to maintain a state of sustainability.
A long answer, but I'm not quite sure if you've told me yet whether or not the regulatory reform meets your objectives.
The regulatory reform proposed.
Yes.
The regulatory reform in this bill would meet our objectives very nicely, but for the duty of sustainable economic growth.
Fine. I think your first part of the answer is absolutely fine.
Okay. Well, look, seeing as we've gone on to this issue of sustainable economic growth, I've got a couple of other members who will bring in now who want to ask about it. And Alison Johnson, I think, will start.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. We've heard, we've taken evidence over the last few weeks. We've heard from the STUC, who think the legislation is not necessary. We've heard from Scottish Natural Heritage, who believe that the imposition of the proposal for an economic duty to promote sustainable economic growth won't affect what they're doing at all, that it won't make any difference. So we've certainly had some debate over whether or not it's necessary. But I'd just like to, I know that Scottish Environment Link strongly oppose the introduction of a duty, and that SCDI are cautiously welcoming of it because you are concerned that sustainable economic growth isn't defined within the legislation, so that duties of the same effect are open to interpretation. I'd just like to ask you both, to begin, how you see this economic duty sitting alongside other core functions and duties that are already placed on regulators.
Well, can I start by saying I would try and follow this through to what's going to happen if you pass the clause. The first thing is good relationships have been building up between environment and conservation groups at local and national level across many years. Many of our members have worked with many developers on many projects to make sure that problems are ironed out, and we've worked with the regulators and with government officials too to make sure that problems are ironed out and that developments can go ahead smoothly. And we're interested in continuing that process rather than sowing any bad blood between ourselves and developers. We're not in the business of dashing into conflict at the first possible opportunity. We understand the need for economic development, along with other developments. The second practical point is this. In the evidence that we presented, you may have noticed that we drew out a flow chart as to what might happen here. And we think that if you develop duties of sustainable development, which are already there on all of the regulators, it comes from a clear background in international law, through EU law, UK law, and in Scottish law already. But sustainable economic growth has no connection to international law, and the proposed statutory duty, even if you go into all of the semantic arguments, or whether they're fundamental, as I believe, about what sustainable actually means, the danger is that what you're going to have is perceptions of the law that differ from different parts of the Scottish community. And that will end up in the courts, because if developers think, well, there's been a duty of sustainable economic growth and we're trying to promote economic growth and we're not getting it because an environmental protection agency is trying to protect the environment, then the tendency will be to take the matter and challenge it in court. But if an environmental group sees an economic development which it thinks is unsustainable, it will say, well, we think they've got a duty of sustainable development and we'll take them to court. Either way, you'll end up with the courts deciding, and the courts in Scotland have a reputation for not taking a decision on the substance, but merely deciding on the merits. So what comes out at the end of the process, we don't know. But the one thing that I would suggest on a practical basis is that you'll come out at the end of the process without the clarity which business needs, and without the clarity that environmental groups need. You'll come out with a process where you've passed a law which is actually confused and unclear. And that is the real danger at a practical level, that instead of decreasing conflict in the system of business developing the economy and environmentalists trying to protect the environment, you'll actually have created less clarity and more chance for conflict. And I wouldn't like to see that, and neither would the members of Environment Link.
It's the same question of Mr Williams.
Agree with Andy's comments on some of the positive relationships that have been developed at a local level between businesses and environmental groups, and that has facilitated developments in a better way than they would have otherwise. In our written evidence, we did raise some concerns about how the duty would be applied and the definition. I understand that the Minister has sought to provide information on how sustainable economic growth would be defined. We commented around the need to ensure that the duty did not undermine the regulator's statutory objectives or the principles of regulation. The point I was trying to make earlier was that we have seen in recent years SEPA, SNH, who've been mentioned, work more closely with business to play a more positive role as new industries have emerged and encourage innovation and so on. And we recognise the positive role that regulation can have in the economy, but our members still raise some concerns about how regulation is applied at a more operational level. Now, Andy will say, well, that reflects practices by businesses. Our members say to us that they have challenges with regulators, and that is why we believe that this new duty could have a positive effect and encourage the growth that we do need.
Briefly.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point in my answer to Alison Johnston. I would hate it to be thought that this is just the environment organisations coming along and having a wee greet on this issue. But the argument that I'm moving with regards to the consistency and the clarity of the law, I think you'll find is substantially backed by the Law Society of Scotland and the UK Environment Law Association in their submissions, which I've seen for the RACHI committee. I don't know if they submitted to this committee.
More question. We heard earlier about the hydro scheme and the freshwater pearl mussel example or case. If we're looking at a case like that, how do witnesses feel that compliance with the duty would be monitored and how failure to comply might be addressed? If you have a case where a developer feels that something isn't being allowed because there's a particularly important species in that area, how will the regulator's performance be monitored, by whom, and how will any concerns be addressed? Mr Miles.
Well, I think that it's, apart from anything else, Parliament's job to scrutinise and monitor the regulators as agencies of government. So I would hope that this committee and the other committees of Parliament will be able to scrutinise the performance. But on the freshwater pearl mussel, can I just say that it's not always a case of a hydro scheme coming along and wrecking the pearl mussel. In Parliament a few weeks ago in Mary Scanlon's debate, she highlighted the case of one of our distilleries which worked in conjunction with academics, with an environment NGO, redirected the outfall from a new distillery that was planned because of a freshwater pearl mussel colony in the river, and is now going ahead to call a whisky, I believe, the Pearl of the Spey, or one of the other rivers in Scotland, that is actually making the quality of our environment a feature in promoting economic growth, sustainable economic growth, because it took account of the fact of what biodiversity was there present. The environment is not a block on business. It's not a block on development. Vast amounts of our economy depends on the quality of our environment and its sustainable development. So I just hope that in its scrutiny of agencies and its work in the short, medium and long term, that members of Parliament will remember that the economy is somewhere that we all live, we all work, and we all attempt to produce a livelihood.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, convener. I'm very curious about Mr. Miles' reading of the bill, because I would have thought that he would have welcomed those aspects of the bill that seek to free up resources on the part of the environmental regulators, take them away from some of the, kind of smaller petty stuff and allow them to deal with some of the bigger problems that they seem incapable of dealing with. And what I would, just to illustrate that, my mailbox invariably gets filled up with very small businesses who have the, to use your metaphor, the ton of bricks falling on their head for very minor infringements. And yet, equally, I have members of the public writing to me about maybe some big organisations who seem to be able to pollute the environment with impunity, and the regulators lack the teeth or the resources to deal with them. So do you know, in that sense of refocusing of resources, do you not welcome that as a perhaps better way of protecting the environment?
Yes, and we have. We've welcomed it in our written evidence. We've welcomed it in the work we've done with SEPA and elsewhere. We're very much in favour of better regulation because we believe in environmental regulation, and we want it to be as good as possible. And if that means assisting and working with business to make sure that it flows in the right direction, and that firms that are observing environmental regulations and following the law perfectly, go ahead, fine, and then the agencies can come down, as I said in my opening statement.
Mr. Miles, if I could just, we've got a lot of business to get through. You actually, the first word was the correct one when you said yes. That answered the question. And on another area, do you accept that sometimes, for the best of intentions, there's a degree of overlapping of regulation, and that, you find that maybe businesses can be stuck between two difficult places where one regulator says, you have to do A, and another regulator says that you have to do B, and that the businesses are stuck in the middle, unable to proceed because of the lack of clarification? And do you not welcome that aspect of the bill that seeks to deal with that? Can you understand their frustration?
I can understand their frustration, because when it applies to our members, they can have one agency telling them one thing about a European regulation or a piece of law, and another agency telling them another thing, and that lack of clarity, I've already said, I'm totally in favour of, but that does not make me in favour of a duty of sustainable economic growth.
Now, but you've said earlier that sustainable development would be all right, but not sustainable growth. Now, I'm struggling to think of a practical application where you could illustrate the principle that you're talking about, because we can argue the theory of this and the semantics of it for weeks, and I think Mr. Watt said we'll be no better off. So it might help us to understand what you mean if you were able to give an example of a practical manifestation of that would illustrate the point.
What I've already given you, a very practical one. There was an unsustainable development which destroyed a freshwater pearl mussel colony in Glen Lyon, and there's another one that's producing sustainable economic growth. I think that's a fairly practical example of exactly what I'm talking about.
I'm struggling with that particular example and the reason I'm struggling with it is that I understand the freshwater mussel has been protected for a long time, and there's legislation protecting it. So if some people break the law, that doesn't seem to, take the case forward that you're trying to make. People will, unfortunately, on occasion break the law. but I don't see how that impacts on this particular bill, because I think the focus of the bill is to free up the regulators so that they're able to provide resources where it really matters, such as in protecting the freshwater mussel.
I'm struggling to understand at the present moment whether we're dealing with the bill as a whole or the bill in its parts, because in general, Environment Link is perfectly happy with this bill as it goes forward. It has been involved in its development in our discussions. So we're not here to oppose the bill, and that seems to be the thing that you're saying, that we're opposing the bill. We're not.
No. I'm suggesting that perhaps you're misunderstanding the point and effect of the bill, but I would take you back to the question I asked. Now, I don't think the freshwater mussel illustrates the point at all well. It's been protected by legislation for a long time. If the regulators aren't doing their job or aren't able to do their job, then that's a separate issue. What I asked you is, can you give me a specific example that would illustrate the point where by application of the principle of sustainable economic growth, as opposed to the principle of sustainable economic development, you know, give me a concrete example of where the problem actually lies in your mind between those two concepts.
I'm sorry, but I really do fail to understand. Could you explain, you know, why there is a difference? Because what I've said quite clearly is that, from our point of view, we think that the key word here is sustainable. And the distinction that I've made is between sustainable economic growth as a subset of sustainable development, without separating them out into two opposing things, which you seem to believe in and I don't. I thought that the exchange with Mr. Brodie, where we agreed to disagree effectively, had said that. The same again, I think we're just going to agree to disagree. We believe that there is unsustainable growth, and that this Parliament has already passed legislation saying that it is in favour of being against unsustainable growth.
Yeah, I think we're possibly talking at cross purposes. So just my final question on this point, because I think it's important that we get this correct. What you're suggesting is that you have no problem with sustainable economic growth.
I wouldn't say that. We have no problem with the idea of sustainable economic growth, but that is not the same as putting the duty in the bill. Now, the distinction that I'll make for you here is that with the duty of sustainable development, which has been put into law by this Parliament in other bills, and in the foundational duties for many of the regulators, including SNH and SEPA, the sustainable development that is talked about there is developed from the Brundtland Commission, from the Rio de Janeiro Treaty, and down the line of international law.
Sorry, Mr. Miles. I think you've already made the point. I think you're making the point about a legal definition. You've made that point already.
No, that's not the point that I'm trying to make.
Sorry then, okay.
The point is that it is there as sustainability. Now, that sustainability is about making sure that when we consider matters, we consider economic, social and environmental development together. And that within reasonable terms, there is a balance between them. If you start saying, right, well, in fact, that bit of sustainable development is the most important. Economic development is the most important bit of sustainable development for us because, for example, we're in the middle of an economic crisis. Unfortunately, what you're doing is you're trying to divide up a concept which cannot be divided. It is not a divisible concept. Sustainable development means achieving balance, and you can't do that by imposing imbalance.
Sorry, I mean, you really will have to help me out here. Can you point to the part of the bill where there's any suggestion that there will be greater emphasis on any part of the term, or that the word sustainable is to be discarded in future?
No, but by saying sustainable economic growth, you're actually saying that economic growth is somehow more important. If I came along and said to you, well, to balance this up, within the concept of sustainable development. What you've got to do is take all the legislation for Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Scottish Enterprise, Scottish Development International, and you've got to give them, on top of their existing duties, a specific duty to respect environmental limits. That would be the equivalent of what you're doing, imposing a duty of sustainable economic growth without reference to the duties of sustainable development
Thank
on
you,
the
Mr.
environmental
Miles.
agencies.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think you've more than answered the question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just before we leave this point, seeing as Susan Love and David Watt have been very quiet, just so for the record, can we get an understanding? I know from the Federation of Small Business written response, I think you welcomed the duty to promote sustainable economic growth. Is that correct, Susan Love? Yes. David, what's the IOD's position?
Very much welcome, actually. And I think the point is, I'm a bit of a loss as why anybody would be against it. I just can't really see why you'd be against it, but that's another issue and perhaps a separate discussion. But can I just make one point as well? And I think that the focus, I go back to the point I made about vision and focus, what I think this bill does, and by putting the term in the bill, actually focuses people's attention on that. And it's fine to say that we're all focused on that. Truthfully, I'm not convinced that local authorities, for example, if we look at our town centres, has that been the focus over the last 25, 30 years? And the answer is no, it hasn't. Is that the focus in Edinburgh City Council when they put my parking charges up by 80% every so often? That's not sustainable economic growth. It's not helping the shops in John Street. So, I mean, there's some issues there. I think that's what it actually focuses people's attention on.
One brief follow-up to that, and then to yourself and then to Susan Love. Do we need a definition of what sustainable economic growth is?
Personally, I would prefer not to have one. I think there is a possibility, where I must agree with Mr Mills, there is a possibility we could end up in court if we don't have one. But I think it is, again, truthfully, we could all sit, we're already started it, we could sit here and discuss the word sustainable all the time and the difference between growth and development. And I personally think the term is bluntly self-explanatory. It's sustainable, it's economic, and it's growth. It's pretty simple to me, but maybe I'm just pretty simple.
Just to answer that point, I mean, reflecting on the conversations that have taken place about this, I'm not convinced that the definition of sustainable economic growth is really the problem, because there are various definitions floating around, but they more or less equate to the same principles. The difficulty is the parameters in which the duty will apply, regardless of the definition. It's, will the duty apply at a strategic level? Is it about regulators having the correct procedures, processes in place to demonstrate that they are complying with the principles of better regulation and therefore contributing to a supportive business environment? Is that what it's about? Or is it about individual operational decisions which could be challenged if they're felt to go against the definition that's agreed on sustainable economic growth? So I'm not sure that a definition takes us a whole lot further forward. I think the debate is around the parameters of the duty and the extent to which the code of practice will sort that out and reach a suitable conclusion, because I agree there are concerns around that.
Yes, just to follow up on that reference to operational decisions, one of the examples that was perhaps posed as to where there might be such a challenge would be where a supermarket development, for example, was refused, and it was they able to argue that that was against the principle of sustainable economic growth because it was going to create jobs. Do you have any concern that smaller businesses might not have the same ability to challenge this or take it to court as larger businesses who have generally been better at pressing their corner in regulation terms?
I think if, as I said, if the parameters in which the duty applies are not clarified, then I agree that may be an unintended consequence, that that larger companies with deeper pockets will use the duty if there's any uncertainty in law to challenge decisions. But again, I come back to the point that I think it's about the parameters in which it applies, and I would envisage that the planning authority would have to demonstrate that the correct balance had been followed and that they had put in place procedures to consider that economic impact. I don't think there's any suggestion that it's any economic growth, any jobs at any cost.
Yes, sorry.
Okay, I think we need to move on. Margaret McDougall.
Yes, there is provision for opt-out within the bill, but the criteria is not clear. I just wondered what the panel had to say on that. Do you think there's sufficient information in the bill on opt-out?
View on that?
Sorry. So if you want, I don't think that there is. It's not clear in the bill, but my understanding is that would be worked out as part of the code of practice with the group that's been set up to discuss this. I should say that in the discussions of how we envisage this working, the opt-out would be around situations where there's a clear local circumstance that would require a different approach. Again, how you would define that would be up for discussion, but it would come back to the kinds of issues we'd spoken around before in terms of if it was something that was particularly related to a particular place or community where a different approach was clearly required, then certainly the scenarios that we envisaged, it's fairly easy to see where an opt-out would be asked for and where it might be granted.
You don't feel you have to contribute unless anything particularly you want to say. If not, Andy Miles.
Well, yeah, well, a very, very quick response. I don't think that Environment Link would be particularly keen to see an opt-out in the Code of Practice. On a more practical level, though, following through the discussions and following on from your question, there is one question that has to be asked. Would it not be better if clear direction could be given to the regulators in the grant and aid letters rather than by putting it into law? Because my understanding of grant and aid letters is that the clear political direction for the need for economic growth and the need to take into account local circumstances could be quite easily put in the text of a grant and aid letter, and that there are alternatives to actually creating this whole legal challengeable structure within the law of Scotland.
Just follow on then with where there is potential conflict if Scottish ministers are setting the regulations and they are also deciding where there should be exemptions. Do you think that's a conflict of interest?
Again, coming back to how we hope this can be used in relation to local regulation, Parliament has tended not to take a view on the kinds of matters on which an opt-out would be granted. So I'm not necessarily sure there would be a conflict for Scottish ministers if they were making a judgment on whether an opt-out was agreed or not. But again, I come back to the fact that it would be my hope that this would be a collaborative process.
Okay, couple of technical matters we can maybe raise. Section 1 of the bill has provisions about the compliance and enforcement of regulations, and I wonder if anyone's got any concerns about that they want to raise. And secondly, the code of practice on regulatory functions to be followed in issuing the code. I wonder if anybody's got any concerns about that, for example, the level of consultation, or is that something you're all quite happy with? Andy Miles?
Yes, in front of the Rural Affairs Committee, I expressed on behalf of Environment Link concerns that there were various caps being put on penalties and that these were questionable, and I would refer the committee to the evidence that I gave there in some detail.
No concerns about the code of practice?
I think there are various aspects at the moment that are unclear about it, but there is a process set up to determine what it will look like. We certainly have our view on what we hope the Code of Practice will contain and what it will achieve, but we're happy with what's set out, but we're happy if others feel the consultation isn't wide enough as set out in the bill. We're quite happy for that to be looked at.
It's very difficult to actually make any comment on the Code of Practice without seeing a draft in front of it, and it must be very difficult to create legislation in this matter without seeing the Code of Practice first.
I understand. I think the question was the principle. which some might suggest it defies collaboration, because the code of practice will be issued by the Minister in terms of asking regulators to comply with certain practices. I mean, do you or disagree with the principle?
Practice?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Okay, another issue in the bill that we've heard quite a lot of evidence so far has been the issue around planning fees, and particularly the proposal to, in effect, penalise planning authorities who are poorly performing by reducing the planning fees they can charge. Margaret McDougall, I think you were going to ask about that.
Thank you. It was really just to get the panel's views on whether you think this proposal to reduce or sanction planning authorities who are underperforming, and do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea? I know in your submissions you have commented on that, but if you could perhaps briefly say for the record what your views are, and also how would you define unsatisfactory performance?
Jump in first. I've been unusually quiet, so but first of all, welcome penalising poorer performance, to be quite honest with you, and I think there is undoubtedly still, if I'm honest, and people come and speak to me or have problems, I'm going to say number one is still the banks, but number two, are pretty close to it, will still be planning. And I think you probably get that as MSPs as well, I suspect. And part of it is the delay is the number one thing probably within that. Yes, there's sometimes confusion over regulations and how they're interpreted and things, but actually delay is a big issue. And I always say people might have a problem with it, but they'd actually rather have a very early no than it might be okay and not very sure where they're going. So delays are very frustrating. And they're also, the inconsistencies are frustrating for developers. I mentioned the hotel earlier on, who are looking to develop in different parts of Scotland. I really don't think there's a, well, there are obviously local variations, there are local staffing levels and all sorts of things as well. And there's local different views in councils, and maybe different political views in councils. There shouldn't be a massive difference between one another. It's just really not acceptable, and it's not good for the whole country. So I think we need to do that. So I'm very much in favour of that. I've got to say, first of all, it's still a big issue. And while I think that the last planning bill actually did begin to change the culture, I really do feel the planning department should see themselves as part of this, and that's where I think the Sustainable Economic Growth about developing the country. It's not about constricting the country. Developing it in a sustainable, sensible way is what they're there to do, and to do that as quickly as they can in a positive way.
Is that how you would define a good performing authority then, if it processes the applications quickly rather than quality applications?
Quality is quite hard to judge, and I mean quality, and again, if you bluntly look, I now work in this city and I look around some of the buildings that have been approved in the past, and I just cringe in actual fact. So quality is quite a hard thing very often to see in retrospect when you actually look at physical buildings. But I do think, so I'm not quite sure who would be the judge of quality, but certainly the judge of time is one key factor. It is absolutely a key factor. But no, I'm not suggesting we rush through bad decisions. That's not what I'm saying. So I'm saying number one we should be looking to say, here is a development being proposed, let's see how we can do it. Not if we can do it, but let's see how we can do it. If at the end of the day we can't do it because it breaks all sort of rules, regulations in terms of, or it's damaging the environment and the population, that it's not going to be worthwhile, let's not go for it. And let's make that decision very early on, or move it to another location that might be more suitable or something. That's fine, but approach it in a positive way and in a timious way, because business loses interest. And I mean, we can sit here all day talking about delays of time planning, and I'm sure members don't need me to tell them about that. They get complaints about that all the time, and if they don't, I'll start sending them some.
I would agree with David that there is a problem here, and it's not just a problem for developers, it's a problem for anybody if there is differential performance between planning authorities, and there are some that are very good and there are some that are less good. But in our evidence, we suggest that we're not sure of the evidence that effectively finds taking money away from them is going to be the solution to the problem. And that indeed it might actually add to the problems by causing corner cutting. I think that the single outcome agreements, which were introduced several years ago by the SNP government, were something that we supported from Scottish Environment Link. They're negotiated regularly between government and each local authority, and they might be a much better mechanism to actually get this, rather than putting it into law in this bill in a fashion which I think is more clunky and legal rather than administrative and admonitory, because I think it's that actual process of government and local authorities working together to improve their performance, which is most likely to work, rather than using a mechanism which might actually have consequentials which are unforeseen or make the problem even worse.
I think this is the area of the bill that we have most concern with. I should say that we warmly welcome the principle of linking fees with performance, but we are concerned that what's being proposed is a bit of a blunt instrument. We would prefer if there was a link between certain milestones being achieved through the process and overall customer satisfaction. Our concern with reductions in planning fees is that would reinforce a cycle of underperformance, and that would obviously have negative consequences for those local areas. We're concerned as well about how it would be applied. Time, obviously, to reach decisions is a very important aspect, but it's not the only one, and it is more of an output than an outcome, and we want the right outcome within the planning system. And we're also conscious that it's not simply in local authorities' hands as to how long these processes can take. So it would be, on the face of it, unfair to penalise local authorities for every delay. We do have worries as well that emphasising the time taken may reduce then resources which are devoted to other areas, such as the pre-application process, which is very important for business and can lead to better developments from both perspectives, and some other areas of the planning system that might not fall into to this particular change, and then might be deprioritised as a result.
Susan Love?
Just completely concur with what Gav's just said.
Fine. Margaret? Okay. Brief supplementary, Mike McKenzie?
Yeah. Again, I'm concerned about a number of misapprehensions here, because my understanding in my reading of the bill suggests that the framework for monitoring performance of planning authorities is the planning performance framework that's been drawn up by heads of planning Scotland, not by government. So it's, time is one aspect of that, but I'm actually interested to hear what Susan has to say, because in your written submission you, I think, made a very important point, and it was that small businesses are often rooted within their communities, and so they're not in the position maybe of some bigger developers who are saying, I want to build, I don't know, wind turbines or whatever, and look about the whole of the country to see where they might do it. Small businesses tend to be rooted within their community, and therefore don't have that choice. How would you tackle, because I know again in your written evidence that you suggest that you're maybe not dead against it, but a wee bit unsure about using the stick of reduction of planning fees to improve a badly performing planning authority. How would you suggest that we tackle the problem? Because there's no doubt about it, when you look at the first national report, that you can see there are some good planning authorities, but some that are very bad. How would you suggest tackling this?
I had a great answer to give to solve the planning problems. I think the types of issues that we would regard as being good quality planning for small businesses are around recognising small business applications, recognising the additional consultation that might be required, the additional checking that might be required at early application stage, recognising the specific financial constraints that a small business might have in terms of delay from planning permission to construction. And these tend to be around culture and processes. And we're just not sure that those will be assisted by penalising the authority in which that business is based and isn't going to leave. We're just not seeing the connection of how reducing their fees will bring about those changes that we'd like to see. And I don't have a magic answer of how we will do it, but we're not convinced this is the answer to it.
Okay, thank you. You know, I think David Watt made a very good point about town centres, where regulators have not adapted sufficiently quickly to changing economic trends or circumstances. Do you feel that flexibility in the planning system may allow that kind of adaptation that's required to keep pace with the economic times?
I'm not sure that question is directly relevant to the provisions of the bill.
Yeah, but I think it's pertinent to the general discussion. Can you?
Well, I'm afraid we don't have time for a general discussion. I think, you know,
Okay.
I mean, if anybody wants to make another point about the specific point on reducing fees and the impact that might have on local authorities, happy to hear that. David Watt.
While I understand some of my colleagues' reservations, I really haven't seen any other impetus that has actually produced the goods in certain situations as well. This is a massive business frustration. I think it shouldn't be underestimated. And not just that, I think there's a potential, and I can't quote specific examples. I have heard a number of cases, however, where potentially Scotland in certain areas certainly have lost businesses and employment because of the sloth of planning. So we can't just accept it's okay. It's not okay. It's got to improve. I can understand the reservations about saying that cost is the only factor, but it's a factor. And it's not unfair to say that some local authorities have looked at it in that front as well as an income earner. So I think there's some issues around about it. I think this is probably quite a sensible step. It might not solve the whole problem, but it's a step in the right direction. I think we shouldn't underestimate the real crucial importance of improving this process. It simply isn't good enough at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to bring in Dennis Robertson.
Thanks, Gabriel. It's probably a fairly straightforward one, I would think, and maybe start with Susan. With regard to the mobile food trading, it's been proposed within the bill issuing a single certificate, which would enable, obviously, mobile traders to move from authority to authority. Do you agree with that proposal, or do you have any concerns around the issuing of a single certificate?
No, I completely agree with it. It's a sensible solution that has been worked up over time after a problem was reported to the Regulatory Reform Group. It's a sensible solution. It highlights the kind of problems that exist and how we need to tackle them. I am aware others have had concerns around the need to still enable inspections in whichever area the business is operating. That is completely understood. No one has ever argued with that.
So in principle, basically, you're saying absolutely, and local inspection with regard to food hygiene is probably still an essential factor.
Yes, and I don't think anyone's disagreed with that.
That's fine. Anyone? Any other comments with regard to that?
Okay.
No?
Thank you.
That's fair enough. No, that's fine.
Thank you. One other thing I'd like to ask, I think this is to Andy Miles in relation to section 40 of the bill, which is on marine licence applications. In your written submission, Environment and Link raised some concerns about marine licensing, and particularly this question of the appeals process and the legal framework around that. Can you just say briefly what your concern is there?
Well, yes, the concern is that we're getting another ad hoc solution piled on top of an ad hoc solution, and that really that what we need is a more comprehensive solution. There is to be, we believe, consultation coming forward on the possibility of an environmental tribunal or a court or changes to that system which would allow for a comprehensive solution to environmental law, which would give more clarity for everybody. What we're seeing here in section 40 of the bill is part of the Marine Act, where a problem had definitely arisen because Marine Scotland not being a separate entity from government ministers meant that government ministers were going to be hearing appeal against the decision of government ministers, which was going to cause a problem. So they'd put a complicated structure in place to try and deal with that. It hasn't been used. We don't know whether the solution that was actually achieved in the Marine Act has been broken. So we don't know whether it needs fixing. But a new system is coming in, and we think that there are other places where this would be better dealt with, either in terms of court reform or in terms of the overall structure of environmental law reform and environmental court law reform. We also think that there are serious problems which we raised during the business regulatory process in discussions with civil servants, that the Aarhus Convention may be being seriously damaged here, particularly with regard to the time limits for appeals. And where we understand exactly what the government are trying to do, we think that this is quite definitely the wrong way to actually go about doing it. And we also think that it's not at this moment necessary, because the Marine Act provisions have still to be brought in and we can see whether they actually do work or not.
D. Anybody else got anything they want to ask this panel of witnesses that have not already brought up? If not, we will draw the session to a close. Thank you very much to our panel for coming along. It's been very helpful to the committee to have your views. Can I ask committee members, just before we suspend, are members happy that we move item 5 on the agenda up to a discussion now, in which case we will suspend and go into private session?
Yep.
Agreed?
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll suspend and go into private session. Right, if we can reconvene, we have our second panel of witnesses in relation to our scrutiny of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. I'd like to welcome David Martin, who's Head of Policy at the Scottish Retail Consortium, Linda Oldfield, who's Regulation General Manager at Scottish Water, and Paul Watterson, Chief Executive of the Scottish Licensed Trade Association. Before we get into questions, is there anything you'd like to say by way of an introduction? If not, I'm just happy just to go straight into questions. Thank you. There's a number of areas I think we'd like to touch on this morning. Issues around consistency in terms of interpretation of regulations. I think we'll look at about this question of opt-outs and how that's to be administered. The question of a duty to promote sustainable economic growth. Questions around the code of practice, questions around planning fees, and questions around street traders licences, and finally the question of primary authority partnerships, which I know the SRC are particularly interested in. We're a little bit tight for time this morning. We have a very busy programme, so I would ask members if they can direct their questions at a particular witness, and if you would like to come in and respond to a question that's going to somebody else, just catch my eye and I will bring you in as best I can. Can I maybe just start off by asking, in terms of the sort of general purpose of the bill about improving regulatory consistency, do you think this bill will achieve that? And fundamentally, do you think there is a need for better regulation in Scotland? Paul Watterson, let's start.
Well, I think it's very difficult in our part of the world in licensing. We have over 17,000 licences. That involves hotels, pubs, nightclubs, supermarkets, and other types of off-sales. About 70% of these outlets are individually owned or operated. Each one has its own operating plan. So consistency is something that has never, even since the 76 Act, is never something that we found within licensing. We've also got all the different boards. Some local authorities have more than one board and they compete. So we really need something to try and bring in consistency, probably in 3 areas. Policy is bad enough. There are problems with policy, but in terms of fees, the paperwork, the processes, the definitions, we hope that this bill will help do that. We certainly need that. I think the Act, the 2005 Act, didn't learn from the 76 Act in a lot of ways and gave a lot more power back to the local licensing boards, which didn't help.
From Scottish Water's perspective, obviously we're quite intensely regulated, both on sort of economically and for the quality of drinking water, as well as for the environment. In terms of consistency of regulation, we believe that consistency of regulation and national measures, that's featured quite highly across all of the consultations that's come out from Scottish Government in the last year in relation to better regulation. And as the largest single organisation regulated by SEPA, we've worked closely with them to ensure that we do have clarity and consistency. And so in terms of additional consistency that this bill would bring, we would welcome that.
David Martin.
Yes, we certainly welcome the legislation. Two main reasons here is, for us, better regulation is incredibly important for achieving equivalence across Scotland for what is Scottish-wide and UK-wide retailers. It enforces competition law, and it also means that our businesses can operate more effectively, more competitively, if we have that clarity in regulation. I think the second reason that the legislation is important is because there is a problem, and as Paul has mentioned, there is a problem with alcohol legislation. There's a range of issues there around the 2005 Act and the 2010 Act. We've had a problem with knives in terms of the definition of domestic and non-domestic knives, and the SRC redeveloped guidance on that, but being guidance, it wasn't adopted by all local authorities, and yet so emphasises the need for legislation. And we've had issue around the tobacco display ban. Again, there's been inconsistent interpretation of how members should comply with that, and there's a raft of other things: video games, sell-by dates. I could go through a whole list of issues that my members have had.
Okay, thank you. I think an issue I want to look at is the question of local opt-outs, how that is to work in practice. I'll bring in Margaret McDougall.
Yes, the bill does say that the legislation will look at this and there will be opportunities to opt out, but the definition of the criteria is not there. So could you give comment on your view on whether the definition for the criteria for opt-out should be in the regulations?
I think if the legislation is to have any meaning in terms of achieving consistency across the areas that we want it to do so, then I think that needs to be clear. I think from an SRC perspective, we would feel that where possible, because actually we're looking at national standards on processes, and we could get into a debate on whether national standards are about binding local decisions or whether it's about creating consistency in the processes and the enforcement of national legislation. I think we would like to see as few opt-outs as possible, to be honest, because that way we get greater consistency. And that's part of, in terms of our proposals for primary authority, would feed into that in terms of the opt-outs.
From Scottish Water's perspective, opt-out is not really an option for us. What we do welcome is nationally a consistent approach, but then the ability to be more flexible on a local basis where local factors need to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, as few opt-outs as possible. We'd have to really see the detail and what these opt-outs would be to try and gauge how we would feel on that. But certainly, if we're talking about consistency, then you want as few opt-outs as possible.
To have that flexibility in there where you could use that
I think there's always,
approach.
I think there's always room for local input to situations, but again, it depends on what it is specifically.
Concerns around ministers, Scottish ministers setting the regulations and then also deciding on who should be exempt?
I don't think we do have a problem with that. I do think that's perhaps one of the disadvantages of national standards as it's being defined in terms of what the legislation is trying to achieve, because it means that it's very much in terms of driving consistency, it's a top-down approach. It's, you know, government decides, government drives it. Whereas, as we've included in our written evidence, we are proponents of the primary authority principle, and that's very much business-led, and that's led in cooperation with the regulators, with local authorities, and that's very much a bottom-up approach. So, in principle, if we have national standards, I have no issue in terms of ministers running that, but I do think that is one of the defects of national standards in terms of driving consistency.
I think when you're dealing with national standards, I think, you know, it's certainly what David's saying is correct. But when you're dealing with individual operators, it becomes a bit more difficult. So we really have to look at that, I think, in some more detail.
One aspect of the bill that's created quite a lot of heat from various other witnesses is the question of the duty to promote sustainable economic growth that's going to apply to public bodies. So we have a few questions on that. I'll start with Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Convener. I think I'll direct my question in this instance to Belinda Oldfield, if I may. I note that you're content that the duty is there as long as it's taken in its proper context. I think that seems to be what your evidence is suggesting. The Law Society of Scotland, though, they are less content with the duty being included in the bill. They point to the uncertainty of what the phrase means and say that it's unsatisfactory for legislation to impose a legal duty where there is so little clarity as to its meaning, regardless of the intention to provide guidance on the issue. And they also suggest that it's unclear what yet another duty on public bodies will achieve and how it will fit with their other statutory duties, and that this might raise questions about legal enforceability. I'd just be, I would appreciate if you could give your views on how Scottish Water will manage to balance those duties which may, from time to time, come into conflict.
Okay. Section 38 of the bill introduces a general purpose for SEPA to carry out its statutory function of protecting and improving the environment and contributing as far as is consistent with its functions to improving health and well-being, as well as achieving sustainable economic growth. And I do understand from the previous evidence sessions that this has introduced some confusion, but our view remains that it shouldn't have any negative implications arising from this. Excuse me. We believe that the bill does actually make it clear that SEPA must act in a way that's consistent with its main aim, which is to protect and improve the environment first and foremost. There are regulatory instruments around the Water Framework Directive, for example, which does involve economic tests, and that does ensure that SEPA can use economic tools such as disproportionate cost assessment to make sure that investment in the environment is proportionate. So our interpretation of the bill is that SEPA should be using these tests whenever the legislation allows, and the incorporation of the additional aim to achieve sustainable economic growth gives them additional permission to do that. So our view is that there's a hierarchy: protect the environment and public health first and foremost, then as a regulator implement the regulations, and then as far as it is compatible with both of those, then look at supporting the economy. So we see it as, I mean, it would be perhaps helpful, given the confusion, that some guidance is given or some additional clarity given from this process.
Just like to ask one more question, if I may. We have had other witnesses who have suggested that this is a lawyer's charter, that if you are to, put environmental concerns above the duty to promote sustainable economic growth, and clearly we've had a lot of debate in the committee about what that actually means, you might leave yourself open to legal challenges. Do you have any concerns about that?
I think I'm not legally qualified to comment on that. And from Scottish Water's perspective, I think we see it as a balance, a balancing of all of the duties.
Probably fair to ask both the SRC and the SLTA if they have any view on this measure, and if you support the principle of this duty being brought in, whether the term sustainable economic growth is sufficiently well defined. David Martin.
Yeah, I mean, we support the duty in principle and what it's trying to achieve. I would argue that most regulators that we come across do this on a daily basis. This balance in terms of considering economic considerations. However, pragmatism, isn't always guaranteed, but legislation is, and this duty we see is sort of focusing minds, concentrating minds on that purpose that they should be undertaking. I would suggest that in terms of the practical implications, I would agree that there is some degree of vagueness about how this will actually play out in practice. I mean, from our perspective, we are thinking one example would be on alcohol licensing, where we have 5 licensing objectives in the 2005 Act, and how this duty would interplay with those 5. Some have suggested there should be a 6th objective, which would be economic growth. Would this become a sort of, de facto 6th objective? So I think there's a bit of clarity required about how this would actually play out in practice, but in principle, we do support what it's trying to achieve.
And do you think the term sustainable economic growth is properly understood? Should it be defined in law?
I think absolutely, yeah, I think it is, and I think it fits into the narrative the Scottish Government have had now for about 4 years, and I think everybody's pretty clear what they mean by sustainable economic growth.
Yeah, it was touched on, David touched on it there. I mean, we have a licensing act that's there to control the sale and supply, and you start to put economics into that, and economic growth, then we have problems. So you have, people gaining a competitive advantage by being irresponsible and perhaps using that as an excuse. So I don't know how that, as regards a 6th objective, it would be difficult to balance that out with the other 5. That's our experience, and we see licensing board decisions based on the objectives challenged, and the challengers won. So it's a very difficult balancing act to do, to get the economics right and adhere to the objectives.
Do you think the term sustainable economic growth is well enough defined?
Well, I think we've got to be clear to everyone. Part of the problem we have is when definitions, there's interpretation of definitions, and you have everybody having their own interpretation. How do you define anything? you know, concisely and clearly, and without people having their own interpretation. Yeah, oh, yeah, I've heard that a lot. Yeah, somebody's busy.
Check, Roddy.
I wonder if I may just follow on to that. And the World Bank defines sustainable economic growth as follows: to be sustainable, economic growth must be constantly nourished by the fruits of human development, such as improvements in knowledge and skills, along with opportunities for their efficient use, more and better jobs, better conditions for new businesses to grow, and greater democracy at all levels of decision making. Now, part of the thing we've been struggling here with is probably too much flexibility at the local level in terms of, you know, which actually flies in the face of the World Bank's definition. I mean, in terms of this, trying to secure consistency, and yet allow some level of flexibility, have you any ideas how we might, apart from this bill, might approach that, and in terms of also the overlay of the code of practice which the minister can invoke on any regulator or regulatory body? Have you any idea how we can achieve that?
Well, I just think coming back to, I mean, in terms of the duty and how that sits with a desire for a degree of consistency through national standards. I mean, I'll give the example of knife licensing. So obviously, I think the committee will be well aware that legislation came in. There was a bit of ambiguity around the definition of domestic and non-domestic knives. The SRC, cooperation with the government, the Crown Prosecution Service, the Police and Trading Standards developed guidance which provided that definition. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice recommended the guidance to local authorities and to trading standards officers to follow in terms of the definition. And we've just had a report from the Regulatory Reform Group saying that very few have actually done that. Now, that's guidance. So, you know, I think that was a suggestion, that was advice. I think that sort of emphasises the requirement why we needed something a little bit more robust to get that consistency, which is why we need things enshrined in legislation, which is why I think legislation is important for achieving that consistency. I understand that's why, with the duty, that, if you like, is being put there in the bill, because, as I say, our experience is that by and large, most regulators do consider economic growth, do consider sustainable economic growth and the impact their decisions have on the economy, by and large, but not all the time. And I think it's just like the guidance issue. It's because they can take it or leave it. Whereas when it's actually a duty, when it's in statute, they can't take it or leave it. It sort of concentrates minds. It focuses attention that this is something that has to be done.
Just and perhaps you can all answer this. You mentioned the RRG, the Reform Group. How effective do you think that group has been in terms of providing meaningful guidance and guidance which will be followed?
I should declare that we sit on the RRG, so I will have a slightly biased opinion. I mean, I think the work the RRG does is you know, is very good. We've only joined it recently, but historically, in terms of the analysis it conducts, in terms of the delivery of legislation, in terms of we've had the case with knives, we've had the case with alcohol. I think it's pretty effective at analysing the legislative landscape and looking at how legislation comes in and how effective it is in a sort of, you know, we don't have a better regulation delivery office like they do in England and Wales, but it's the closest thing I think we've got in terms of looking at the effectiveness of legislation. But in terms of cascading down guidance, etc., well, I mean, the only example I can think of where we have required that was on knives, and it was the SRC that took up that mantle.
I think excuse me, from our perspective, the RRG's been reasonably effective. We are quite intensely regulated on all fronts, and we welcome any consistency of approach and the principles of better regulation being cascaded at every opportunity. So we like to see developments in regulation coming through from the Regulatory Reform Group.
Yes, in the preamble to this, each of you mentioned the lack of consistency, to varying degrees, I have to say. And with a group like that, I mean, I'm not suggesting it's a talking shop, but if we're effective, then we might have a bit more consistency and might have to look at what we're trying to do with the bill.
I would, well, in terms of the RRG driving consistency, it doesn't, I mean, I think the best it can do is offer up guidance. And as I think I've discussed with the knife example, you know, guidance doesn't really achieve much, at least in our experience. What we actually need is, as our argument in terms of the bill, is legislation or a new structure that's underpinned by statute, like, for example, primary authority. Now, that's not within the gift of the RRG to establish. So I think as far as it has powers in what's within its gift, you know, I think it does as much as it possibly can.
Wilson, hear you?
Yeah, just to go back to the original question, looking at varying degrees of inconsistency, if you take the over-provision argument, and take the hours argument. So, for instance, hours, which there's a never-ending debate on the hours places should be open, the best people to do that are local licensing boards. If you look at over-provision, which was simply handed, which looks at the amount of licences in an area, whether there's too many or not, that was simply handed to local licensing boards, and really they don't know what it means. So really a national look at that would be far more helpful, because they get into all sorts of trouble when they try and define over-provision. What does it mean? If you've got 2 good pubs in a village and you add one, are you going to have 3 bad ones or 3 good ones? You can end up with 3 bad ones. So, you know, and all the problems of abuse of alcohol and over-competition and prices being put down and so on. So it really depends on the issue on that side of it. So something like over-provision, I think, should not have been handed simply back, you know, under the guise of giving local democracy and local decision-making. So it really depends on the issue you're talking about.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask, there's a couple of fairly technical matters covered by the bill. Sections 5 and 6 deal with a code of practice and regulatory functions. And the procedure to be followed in issuing that code, and, for example, the issue about the level of consultation around that. Section 7 of the bill gives ministers the power to modify the list of regulators attached to that bill. So, for example, those excluded currently are Historic Scotland, Transport Scotland and Marine Scotland. Do any of you have any particular concerns about either the code of practice or the ministerial powers to modify the list of regulators affected?
Concerns about the code of practice, and actually it is going in the same direction of travel we're seeing elsewhere in the UK, so, and actually within the EU, so it seems to be quite a sensible approach.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, I want to move on and talk about another issue, which is the question of planning fees, and in particular the proposal that where there's unsatisfactory performance from planning departments, planning fees might be reduced. I'll bring in Margaret McDougall.
Yes, what is the panel's view on the reducing of fees where a local authority has been underperforming? And could you perhaps give your view on what you think is underperforming and what would be a good performing local planning authority?
Since 2010, Scottish Water has had 291 full planning applications across the various planning authorities in Scotland. We do not see a difference in performance across the planning authorities when it comes to full planning applications. We do see some slight variation when we're looking for applications for permitted development, but nothing that we would want to draw attention to. So therefore we're not really best placed to comment on a penalty regime where there would be any reduction in fees for poor performance. It's not our experience of the planning authorities at this stage, and certainly since 2010.
I think the only view that we took on this at the time of the consultation was that because retail was being singled out as one of those sectors that was going to be a special case and have the fees, the cap increased quite dramatically actually. I think it was, off the top of my head, it was about 18 or 20 times increase on the original fee. At that point, looking at that, certainly my members that operate much larger retail buildings, infrastructure, they certainly felt that there had to be some degree of assurance of quality in the system, given the fact that they were being asked to stump up so much extra for a planning application. So I think it was a quid pro quo from certainly my larger members, in that if you're asking us to pay so much more for the planning process, then we need to see a bit in return. And I think experience, unfortunately, I can only offer anecdotal evidence, is that certainly from our perspectives, we have seen a degree of patchy performance in terms of times for process and for an application, etc.
Do you think that would help the process if you're obviously, you're looking at it from your point of view where you're having to pay more fees, but would it help if the planning authority was penalised for underperforming?
I think we can definitely see both sides of this argument, to be honest. I appreciate that's not the degree of clarity that you would like. I can certainly see that perhaps withdrawing funding from an authority that's already underperforming might seem, slightly counterintuitive. But then, on the other side, I think the argument that certainly my larger members have made, and some property developers that obviously we have contacts with tell us, is that a lot of the problems are not about money, by and large. So it's more structural issues, and money necessarily wouldn't solve that issue. So, and there is an economic, if we're going back to talking about duties and sustainable economic growth, there is an economic imperative for the planning system to be swift and prompt and to be clear, and if it's not, then it's business that is penalised, it's developers that is penalised, and therefore the wider economy suffers. So there needs to be perhaps an incentive. So I can also appreciate the stick approach.
Performing planning authority, do you see that as being one who processes applications quickly, or is it the quality of the finished article?
I think ideally that I think obviously quality is important, but quality, provided with a degree of efficiency is also ideal. I think that I don't think we want planning authorities just rushing through decisions in order to speed up, processes. But I think there's certainly cases of best practice of where you can find a planning authority that can balance both, actually.
We wouldn't add anything to that.
Anything else to add? No. Okay. Thank you. That's all.
Okay. Dennis Robertson.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. This is perhaps not a particularly contentious one. It certainly hasn't been with previous witnesses, and maybe directed to Paul. With regard to the mobile food trading licensing, it's been proposed within the bill that a single certificate is issued to enable, obviously, traders to move from authority to authority, whereas at the moment they would have to apply to each individual authority. Do you agree with the principle within the bill, and do you have any concerns?
Is that of interest to?
I know it's probably
licensed premises.
I think, as I've said before, anything if it's one application to one level, then obviously I think that's to be welcomed. Absolutely, we don't have any problem with that.
David Martin.
I would just say that I think the principle of that is eminently sensible, and you keep hearing me talk about primary authority in the margins, but that is effectively a primary authority principle, if you like. That is how primary authority works, and we're fully supportive of that. And so I think it's a principle that seems pretty sensible, and it operates incredibly well throughout the UK on that basis.
Good, thank you very much.
Yes. Okay, seeing as you've raised the issue of primary authority, this is an issue where the Scottish Government has indicated they are minded to bring forward the Stage 2 amendment to introduce this. When we took evidence from the trade unions, I think that was last week, they raised some concerns about this, and they said this would just lead to people shopping around to find the most lenient local authority and hooking onto that and making sure that they that was regarded as the primary authority, and that would just lead to a race to the bottom in terms of standards across the country. How would you respond to that? And is there any evidence from the experience south of the border as to how things have worked in practice?
Argue this, that I would completely disagree with that statement for three main reasons. Firstly, the primary authority system is policed and governed by the BRDO, which is the Better Regulation Delivery Office, part of the Department of Biz. So there is an oversight about what happens, and they do have a group, they do bring them together. So it is, if you like, policed. Second of all, there is no evidence that that is what is happening, and I would say the majority of my large members are in a primary authority partnership. There's about 700 plus businesses in primary authority partnerships and 109 local authorities, I think, UK-wide in these partnerships. And there's certainly no evidence. Speaking to businesses, they will give you several reasons of why they pick a primary authority. And actually, for example, I was speaking to Home Retail Group, which is Argos, Habitat and Homebase, and they told me, for example, they pick Hampshire for fire safety because it's known as being the most robust and the most difficult to get assured guidance through. And they know that if they're compliant with Hampshire, they will be compliant everywhere else. So it's not in the business's interest. The whole principle of the process is about showing a willingness, a due diligence to comply, not to cheat the system. And finally, there was an independent report in 2010 undertaken by RAND Europe that looked at all of this. And apart from finding all of the, the efficiency savings that it has brought about, it certainly didn't find any evidence that it was being abused by, trying to rush the lowest common denominator.
Okay, we got some follow-up evidence from Unison, who gave us evidence last week, and they said the feedback they'd had from some members was there was a potential conflict of interest because what happened was if the company decided to withdraw from an agreement with the local authority, it was a primary authority, there'd be a loss of funding, and therefore there was a conflict of interest because of the financial inducement involved really to the local authority. Is that something you have a view on?
It shouldn't be, because they shouldn't be funding services off of the fee derived from primary authority. Primary authority is, it's in the statute, should be run on a cost recovery principle. So they should only be charging for the cost of that service. Also, the European Services Directive also mandates that those type of services should be undertaken a cost recovery principle. And we've obviously just had the Hemming versus Westminster City case, which has crystallised that view about local authorities delivering services on a cost recovery principle, which is incredibly pertinent for us in Scotland, given what's going on with alcohol fees.
Okay, thank you. Okay, anybody else, anything they want to bring in at this stage? Okay, if not, I think we're a little bit ahead of the clock. Thank you very much for coming along and giving your evidence. And I suggest to members what we do is we suspend and go into private session to discuss items 6 and 8 on the agenda, if that's agreed. Okay, thank you very much. Right, if we can reconvene, we are at item 3 on the agenda, taking evidence on the Debt Arrangement Scheme Scotland Regulations 2013 in draft. I'd like to welcome Fergus Ewing, Minister for Energy, Enterprise and Tourism, who's joined by Chris Boyland, Head of Strategic Reform, and Claire Orr, Executive Director, Policy and Compliance at Accountant and Bankruptcy, and Claire Tosh, who's from the Scottish Government's legal team. Thank you for coming. Minister, we'd like to say something by way of introduction.
Yes, thank you, Convener, and good morning to members of the committee and clerks. And I'm pleased to be here today to speak to the changes in the DAS regulations. These changes will benefit the debtor by freezing the interest owed on their debts up to 6 weeks earlier than under the current legislation. The date of freezing will be brought forward from the current date, which is the date of approval of the application for a DAS, to the date of the application itself, and that is up to 6 weeks. That will be a modest but significant improvement for many debtors in Scotland. A particular potential use and benefit that this change will have, Convener, is that it may ameliorate the accrual of high interest costs typically accrued under short-term loans, for example, payday loans and credit card debts. The success of the DAS does speak for itself. The Association of British Credit Unions Limited welcomes its use in preference to debt relief products. I think it is better that if people can pay their debts, they do pay, rather than those debts simply being written off. The number of people accessing DAS continues to grow at an unprecedented rate. A further rise of 40% in 2012-2013, making an overall tenfold increase in the last 6 years. The figures are, Convener, 442 DPPs approved in the year 2007-8, up to 4,632 to 2012-13, from 442 to 4632. That really does show that this vehicle is being used, is popular, is working, and should be encouraged for those for whom it is appropriate. The need for this change, I think, does speak for itself. DAS is an adaptable solution designed to respond to market changes, and it is clear we need to make some adjustments. I've mentioned one of them. There are others of somewhat more technical nature, so that we do what we can within the limited powers that this Parliament has in this area to help people whose debt burden may have built up since DAS was last updated in 2011, partly as a consequence of high interest lending. The changes speak for themselves because others have already spoken for them, Convener. I'm very pleased with the broad welcome that our changes have received from organisations such as Citizens Advice Scotland, who have said that our amendments, quote, should have a beneficial effect on their bureau and their clients. Of course, DAS is not the whole story by any means. Last week, the Scottish Government introduced its Bankruptcy and Debt Advice Bill, which will deliver significant reform to bankruptcy legislation in Scotland and help deliver our vision of a financial health service to provide rehabilitation to people who are struggling under the burden of debt. So this isn't the whole story, Convener, but it's an important part and an area where I expect to see continued growth. Later this summer, for example, we are going to run a further television advertising campaign for DAS, and we expect this to increase even further the number of people who will benefit from this important and successful scheme.
Thank you, Minister. I know members have got a few questions they want to put in this section. Can I just remind members to keep their questions relevant, if they would, to the terms of the draft regulations in front of us. Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, Minister. Mr. Tosh, Mr. Boyland, Ms. Orr. I think all this is very welcome and clearly underpins what we would like to see in terms of the arrangements for debt. I just wonder, Minister, if I might dwell on the issue of money advisors. In 2011, under the 2011 regulations, broad classes of people could become approved money advisors but still in 2012, AIB recognised that the lack of access to an approved money advisor may play a part in the uneven uptake of DAS across local authority areas. I just wonder if you're content of the level of qualification that AIB is pursuing in terms of finding acceptable money advisors. There is also a concern, I have to say, that when I look at the list, the top 10 money advice organisations, as per a Spice briefing, that one particular organisation has more than a third of the, it looks after more than one third of the approved DPPs.
Well, as a matter of general principle, it's very important that those people who face debt problems and all that that entails, and it usually entails other problems as well in relation to difficulties possibly at work or in family in relation to health. These are unfortunately part of a syndrome and therefore relevant to individual cases, highlight the need for appropriate advice. And I'd like to pay tribute to the quality of the advisors that we have in the money advice world, in citizens advice and local authorities, and in the professional world too. We are blessed with a high quality of advisors, and of course every case is different. Everybody needs to have their case dealt with not as a number but as a unit, a human being, one unit, one person, one family. So it's very important that that principle is clearly stated, because it's easy to forget that about what we're dealing with here. And I think Mr. Brodie would acknowledge that. You know, there are also other organisations such as Step Change, whose offices I opened not so long ago in Glasgow, who perform a marvellous service to tens of thousands of people in debt problems throughout the country, and other organisations who run, some of them on a not-for-profit basis. The difficulty, of course, is to ensure that there's a sort of reasonable geographical spread across the country, and I think that in part is what Mr. Brodie is referring to, and that is something that we seek to address in every way we can, working with the community to whom I've referred, and it has been a particular problem in the past. I think my officials might be able to give a bit more information as to where we stand at the moment, but I wanted to start off by setting out the principled response that we recognise that the whole system of civilised management of debt and finding the right and appropriate solutions and not the inappropriate solutions does rest on the need and the reasonable availability of a qualified and suitable debt advisors. I don't know if Claire or Chris Boylan would wish to add anything to that, convener, with your permission.
I could add briefly to that. I think when we made the changes to the regulations in 2011, very much the driver was about widening access to DAS through the provision of a larger group of money advisors, and that was when the decision was taken to introduce the provision in the fee charging sector in order to provide that greater access across the country, but also to give those in the need of advice the opportunity to choose where they would go for that advice, to allow people that flexibility of approach.
So they have a choice. Thank you.
Okay, Margaret McDougall.
Just on approved money advisors, the draft regulations propose that it would be possible for money advisors to become approved if they worked for an organisation that is working towards accreditation. When in actual fact it could be then that the organisation doesn't actually have a timetable to be accredited. So therefore, obviously, that means that people could be using that service or money advisor and they don't have that accreditation. I just wonder if that could be firmed up in the proposals so that they did have to have that accreditation, or at least the timescale had to be there, and then if they didn't meet that within the timescale, they were removed from the list.
Well, I've got the answer, but I think Claire can probably provide the sufficient detail.
Yeah, I mean, we recognise that ensuring that there's a good quality of advice there is extremely important, but I think it is important to say that it's not just a case that there would be approval automatically of organisations working towards the national standards. AIB would have in place a very robust process for looking at, exactly as you've said, the timescale that people have intended for achieving the qualification and any other factors. It's different from an automatic approval. There is actually a process around about consideration of what is appropriate, and we'll be happy to develop very clear guidance around about that.
That would be included in the guidance. Right.
We could certainly include, we could make our guidance clear so that people understand what criteria will be important for us in considering that.
Okay. Could I ask another question, but it's on a different topic? It's just that debt given just by the situation that many women find themselves in, there seems to be more women now in debt than there maybe previously was. So I just wondered if there was anything that could be done to help that situation, given, you know, that you can have a 6-month break, for example, for if you were on maternity leave, but that doesn't actually cover the statutory maternity leave period. So could that be looked at?
Well, the current provision under DAS is that the maximum payment holiday that there can be is 6 months, and that is not changed in these regulations. The regulations do introduce a degree of flexibility to make it clear that it can be for a shorter period than 6 months. They don't go beyond 6 months. It was felt at the time that these measures were introduced, and they were introduced incidentally in Scotland ahead of England, and they were supported, I think, fairly widely by debt advisors in the debt advice world, was that 6 months was a reasonable period for a payment holiday, and that it was primarily designed to answer Margaret McDougall's question for those who became redundant and perhaps needed a period of up to 6 months to find another job to get on their feet again. So I think, to be fair, to answer Margaret McDougall's question, that was the prime policy driver of the change. I mean, it may be, and this point I believe was raised by one of the witnesses or those who submitted evidence in relation to the maternity, the length of maternity pay. It may be that that's something that we could come back and revisit at another time and take evidence on that, because were there a need to have further flexibility, then that's something I think we would need to look at on a policy ground. Of course, ultimately the decision is the balance between the interests of the debtor and the interests of the creditor. A payment holiday is that. It's a holiday. It shouldn't last forever. It's of a temporary nature. It's designed to introduce flexibility and cater for life events, and therefore a case can be made along the lines that Margaret McDougall has made, and that'd be something that I'd be happy to consider further in due course, Convener, but it's not part of these current regulations as I understand it. I don't know if Claire or has anything else to add to that.
Nothing to add, that's correct.
Thank you, Convener. We've had, the committee's received some written evidence from witnesses who suggest that it would be worthwhile freezing the interest on debts at an earlier point in the process. And I think they're principally referring to the difficulties of payday loans and the high rates of interest that those loans charge. Does the Minister feel that this is something that perhaps the Westminster Government ought to deal with?
Well, yes, I have made it very clear to my counterpart in the UK Government that we do feel there's a strong case to be considered in relation to regulation of payday loans to limit the amount of interest that can be charged and the way it's charged. And we've made that very clear in debates and in correspondence. That's not a case that, unfortunately, we have been able to successfully pursue with the UK Government, and indeed my understanding is that although there have been welcome steps taken in relation to the investigatory work of a number of individual companies, and that I don't want to prejudice those investigations, but the fact that they are taking place is, I think, welcome by everybody, and that may bring about action. The fact is that as matters stand, and in accordance with the timetable of action envisaged with the new financial authority being set up, it's unlikely that there could be any regulation under the current course of action the UK government pursue for 3 years. And I don't think that's really fully understood. And 3 years is an awful long time for people who have payday loans. And it's an awful long time for more serious problems to arise if payday loans are further to grow in the take-up and the prevalence, the numbers of people who take them out. So that's to answer the general point. Specific point about, could we have brought the date of freeze further forward than the date of application? We were grateful for, I think it was Carrington Dean, for the suggestion, and we considered it very carefully, but we rejected bringing it forward further from the date of application for a number of reasons which we felt were quite solid. First of all, our research shows that in 41% of the cases, debtors who intimate their intention to apply to DAS do not go on to enter a DPP. Now, Carrington Dean said, bring it forward to the date of intimation of the intention rather than the date of application. But because 59% of debtors don't actually go on to enter a DPP, then if a DPP was effectively set up with freezing, and then a number of debtors decided not to go into a DAS, or for whatever reason it wasn't entered into, then in theory that would have to be reversed and interest and charges reapplied. That in itself would be a complex process and may have a negative impact on the debtor, as it's possible that several weeks' worth of fees and charges would be reapplied at once. So whilst on the face of it, it does appear to have a certain logic and desirability to limit high interest accruing under payday loans or credit card debts, to take two examples, in practice we felt it would be liable to be causative of even more problems given the 41% figure take up of DPPs in respect of those debtors who intimate an intention to go into DAS, with the majority of debtors in fact not going on into a DAS after they've gone through the situation with their debt advisor and made a decision. So I hope that clarifies our thinking with the committee, because I appreciate it's a serious and obvious option.
Alison Johnson.
I think the Minister quite rightly noted the expected and occurring increase in DAS applications, which is to be welcomed, as it shows people are seeing this as a real alternative to unmanageable debt rather than bankruptcy. And citizens' advice in their submissions say that they welcome the reintroduction of composition into the regulations, but they were concerned about the length of time it would take a debtor to become eligible for the relief. And certainly the accountant and bankruptcy figures suggest that people will not be eligible for this relief for 12 years, but that the average debt payment programme seems to be taking 6 years and 8 months to complete. So I'd just like to ask, why are the criteria for composition set at 12 years and 70% of debt, given that the average duration of a DPP is much shorter than this? And will this not mean that it will actually be a very few who will benefit from that?
That's a perfectly reasonable question, and it's one that we pondered over carefully, the issue of when a debtor under a DPP should be entitled to seek a composition. And a composition in the legal sense is the right of a debtor to seek to be relieved of a remaining proportion of the debt and reach a settlement on that basis. And when we asked in the consultation document what the fixed period should be, the majority of the respondents gave the answer to the question that we asked, stating 12 years. When we asked in the consultation what the percentage of debt due to be paid before composition became available, and what that percentage should be set at, in other words, if the total debt's £100, what percentage has to be paid before the debtor can enter into a composition? And we gave the options of 50%, 60% and 70%. Of the respondents who answered this question, the 5 stated 50%, 1 stated 60% and 30 stated 70%, with 11 stating it should be another amount. So I think the answer to your question is that we listened to the views in the consultation on the specific question. It's a balance between the debtor's interests and the creditor's interests once again. I think the point should be made that DAS, the purpose of DAS is for debtors to pay off the debts. That is the purpose of DAS. If you were to move to a composition after, say, 2 years, it wouldn't really be a DAS any longer. It would be a form of quasi-debt relief. I mean, as a country, we want people who can pay their debts to pay their debts. And a related issue, of course, is that under the bankruptcy bill, there will be a common financial tool, so that the debtor will be paying from income the same whether the debtor kind of enters a trust deed or bankruptcy. In other words, there's not an inconsistency of approach as to how much from income should be paid. There should be a common approach. I think that's, as a matter of principle, sensible. If at the moment there are some debtors who are paying a total of X pounds and entering a trust deed, for example, but that X pounds could effectively be used in a DAS to go to creditors, or almost all of 90% of which going to creditors, then I think it's sensible, really, that that money should go to creditors under a DAS, rather than the debtor going into a trust deed and then suffering the consequences in regards to financial status, which that entails. So, for all of these reasons, we felt that the consultation respondents supported by majority the 12 years, and they supported by majority the 70%. And for those reasons, as well as the principle which I've tried to set out, we felt that that was the way to go, albeit it does seem quite a long period, and it is longer than the average DAS, which I think is much shorter than that. I'm looking for the statistic, 6.5 years.
Is that something that the Minister would be willing to keep an eye on and review at some point in the future? You know, just given that these people are, you know, can have such a devastating impact on families repaying debt if they have shown willing, have paid off a very large percentage of that debt.
We're always wanting to respond to changing circumstances in society as a whole, but in this case I think we really have responded to the majority of views expressed in the consultation. I mean, plainly some differ, some offered a different view, but we have responded to the majority view, and it does seem that the growth of DAS by tenfold from 442 to 4632 indicates that it is working fairly well at the moment without composition. I think after 12 years, many people would say, well, 12 years is a long time to be paying off a DAS. That I don't, maybe Claire or in a moment, or Chris Boylan could advise the committee, or if we don't have these statistics at hand, we could write to the committee as to the number of DAS which exceed the 12 years. In other words, the numbers that currently may fall into the category where composition becomes possible. I think that would be something that we could write to you about, convener, but it's not really designed to form a sort of backdoor method of debt relief. DAS is a debt debt management tool.
Can I ask a question about something that's come up in evidence from the Association of British Credit Unions, who've suggested that lenders who charge interest up front will have an unfair advantage because they will not be affected by the requirement to freeze interest when a debtor enters a debt payment programme. I wonder if that's an issue that the Scottish Government has considered, and whether there are any plans to take action to try and address that point.
Yes, I think the issue here, convener, is that this is an interesting proposal, and it's similar to policy proposals that we've already considered. But having looked into these matters in a legal sense, and Claire Tosh is here in her capacity as a solicitor for the government, that it seemed to us to reach beyond the effect of a scheme like DAS on debt enforcement and interfere in detail with how lenders charge for and levy interest and loans. And regrettably, it's not clear, because of the question of competence and V-race, whether or not that would be something to which this Parliament could give effect, as it may be partly reserved. Now, I think that's correct, and maybe Claire Tosh can tell me if that's the case.
Yeah, that's correct.
Right. So I think it was an interesting proposal, one that merits consideration, but perhaps goes out with the powers as they currently stand of the Scottish Parliament.
In this whole area, is there a concern about the law of unintended consequences that, if quite rightly we legislate or pass regulations to protect debtors, and that therefore makes it harder for creditors to recover their money, they're then much less likely to lend, which drives the debtors into the hands of the loan sharks.
There's no evidence that process has taken place up to now in relation to DAS, because the figures speak for themselves. There's no evidence of which I'm aware that creditors of lending practices have changed as a result of DAS. I mean, were there any evidence, then Convener, I would be surprised were it not to show that DAS would be seen as a good thing by creditors, because they get paid. They get at least 90% of the total sum due, albeit that there's an element of freezing of interest and charges. So I do appreciate, though, that when considering this whole area, one must be aware of the potential consequences of what one does, and I would subscribe to that as a sensible approach, and one that we bear in mind when considering all reform in relation to debt.
Okay, if nobody else has got any other questions to pursue, we move on to the next item on the agenda, which is a formal debate on the statutory instrument S4M 6986. And I'd ask you, Minister, to move and speak to the motion that the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee recommend that the Debt Arrangement Scheme Scotland Regulations 2013 be approved.
Well, I was pleased to have the opportunity to make an opening statement, Convener, in which I set out in brief the reasons why I feel these regulations commend themselves and should be approved by the committee. So I would, in standing on my earlier remarks, move the motion that the committee approve the regulations.
Thank you. Do any members wish to speak in this debate? Okay, thank you. In that case, I put the question. The motion is that S4M 6986 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Great, thank you. That is agreed. Thank you, Minister, and your officials for your attendance. We'll have a short suspension and go into private session. Thank you.